everyone to our first discussion about the 5G-aliser. So we've been doing this for about a year or over a year now. We created this 5G-aliser to have a fun way to think about how the 5G market is evolving, how it's growing, how it's developing. And for those of you who are familiar with it, you'll know that we have mapped out 20 factors that we think are affecting 5G growth and sort of seeing how they're changing over time. So I've just brought up a picture of the 5G-aliser. I'll introduce it quickly. And then what we're going to do is have a quick informal chat about the things that are, moving and shaking the 5G development in the last few months. So what we've got on the top is a high-level view of 5G supply and 5G demand, with the gray arrows pointing at where supply was a year ago in July 2020, and the dark blue arrows pointing at where supply and demand are, in our view, today. And those supply and demand factors are built up by these 20 factors that we have down along the bottom. And what you can see is the ones that are in dark blue are affecting supply. The ones that are in red are affecting demand, and the ones that are in yellow are affecting both. And what we've done is we have on the middle layer this absolute level, and that's really saying, how important is this for the current development of 5G? And what you can see here that we're saying is that spectrum availability and government strategy on 5G and their policy on 5G are really the biggest factors, followed by the availability of 5G infrastructure skills and the cost of 5G infrastructure. But then there are some that are really becoming more important, and we'll have a chat about that in a minute, and that's on indoor coverage and 5G standalone core that are rising up. Then we also have this sort of relative level. And when we started the 5G-aliser 15 months ago, everything was at this middle level. And since then, the bars have moved up and down. And what you can see is, for example, Open RAN, vRAN has been a very hot topic, a lot of development there. And so that bar has moved up, and equally around private networks, it's been a very hot topic. And you can look at previous editions to sort of see our analysis around that. But others have, since the start of this, become more important. And if you take geopolitical tensions, that's one of them. And that used to be predominantly about the US-China trade war, but it's a bigger picture than that now. The final thing is to note is that we've got the primary factors, and those are the ones that have the biggest weighting. Then we have the secondary factors, and those have a lower weighting. And then there's the wildcards, and those are, medium weighting, but they're very unpredictable. And so those are kind of the introduction to the 5G-aliser and where we are today. And I think the high level picture is that overall supply and demand are still pretty low. And I think that we'll get into that in a minute. So I think time to hand over to everybody else and chat about sort of where we are with the 5G-aliser today. So I think let's start off by getting some input from Dean. Actually, one of the new things that we added on the wildcards or the secondary factors was why 6G matters. So let's dial ahead to 6G, Dean.
Yeah, I mean it's amusing to go straight into the 5G-aliser and talk about 6G. To be honest, until about a year ago, there was early talk about what might 6G look like, but you had organizations like ITU refusing to use the term 6G and referring to sort of network 2030. And everyone's like, we know it's 6G, so just call it 6G. And now there's a huge diversity of initiatives that are coming up on the radar screen from academia, from governments, from vendors, looking at the initial design goals and input technologies for 6G. And part of that, the discussion at the moment is, what are the most important elements? Is it all about, another jump up in speed and another reduction in latency? Or is it perhaps other things that we're going to try to optimize 6G for, like improved energy consumption? could be one. And so you've got all of the various stakeholders trying to, sort of just set out their stalls. A lot of the academics are trying, universities are trying to sort of position their research programs in the context of 6G for the future. Whether that's on the AI side of things, whether it's on, terahertz frequencies, whether it's on, energy efficient radios, or, there's a whole possible, hundreds of possible innovations that might get funneled down to what's 6G about. And at the moment, we're at that early stage. But there's also a couple of extra layers on that. One is around the geopolitics, which is playing into 6G. And there's some early discussion about whether it's going to be a global standard or whether we're going to see a sort of China versus West or China versus West versus India divide. Going back to the days of 3G when there were multiple standards, there was CDMA 2000 and UMTS and a couple of others as well, TDS, CDMA in China. And so we might revert to that. So that's all interesting. And the other question is, who are the stakeholders? And are the mobile operators going to be as deeply involved in 6G, or is it going to be more driven by private networks and other? And one of the paradoxes here is a lot of discussion about the higher millimeter wave bands and even terahertz bands. And they will tend to be covering small areas, which tends to almost define them as being short range, localized, indoor, enterprise centric, perhaps. And there's some of the regulatory bodies having early discussions. There was a workshop that Ofcom in the UK ran about, 200, 300 gigahertz plus to terahertz range recently. So I'll park that, but it's starting to come up as an issue. And then Open RAN, I guess, as well. I mean, the cynic's view of Open RAN is that 5G Open RAN is the beta test, and 6G is actually when it hits the market properly.
Great. Yeah. So the other one that we added this quarter is the sort of 5G IT billing stat. And I think that we added this because, I mean, one of the things thinking about that happened in the last quarter was there was MWC, and one of the splashes at MWC was this telco DR investing in a disruptive cloud-based billing system, Patogi, and people wondering, how did they stand this up so quickly? And, saying we're going to be able to build all kinds of, grow ARPU by having a really flexible, adaptive, AI-infused billing platform. And I think that, I am very skeptical that being more flexible and allowing consumers to chop and change, or, being able to analyze your competitors' tariffs in order to, adapt yours on a half-hourly basis or whatever is going to massively increase ARPUs. That's not going to convince consumers to spend more. But the reality is that that is where we are going. And if you want to sell a slice on demand to a consumer that is gaming, or you want to sell thousands of slices to enterprises, or you want to open out access to APIs, and some of those are going to be really cheap, some of those are going to be more expensive, or you're going to need a system to do that, and telcos are really in the very early stages of doing that. So we've put that on because we think it's going to be important for monetizing 5G.
Yes, and there has been anecdotal evidence, Amy, from some of the research that I've been doing around 5G, that the inflexibility of the legacy IT stack has held back certain telcos' abilities to charge for these more kind of network optimizing type of services. So
yeah,
I think that's another reason why it should be on there.
Super. So, having talked about 6G and the future of billing, we'll kind of drill down a little bit into the, why the slow growth in supply and why the slow growth in demand. So, I mean, hand back to Dean and Harry to chat maybe a little bit about why supply is slow.
I mean, sure, Dean, why don't you start?
Okay, I'll kick off. I think I've said for a long time that and I should put my hand up and say I'm probably the skeptic on the call here, is that 5G is just another G. And frankly, 5G today in most of the world isn't even another G. It's 4G plus plus. Because it's using the 4G core as part of non-standalone deployments in most places. So essentially, and in a lot of cases, it's also using 4G, some of the 4G radio infrastructure as well, maybe for uplink or something else. So it's at the moment, just because you've got 5G logo on your phone doesn't mean it's proper 5G, however you want to define that, or that it does anything particularly new. And the other question is that even as you move towards better versions of 5G, we're starting to see deployment of 5G standalone cores, release 15, in some places, but it's still early days for that. But that's a necessary. It's necessary, but not sufficient for a lot of the fancier future 5G services we talk about, whether it's network slicing or ultra low latency, all that stuff. It needs to have a standalone core. Ideally, it also needs to have release 16 or release 70 standards as well, but they're further in the future. And the other thing is, for a lot of the applications that we like to talk about with 5G, is they work indoors. Unless you want to do your augmented reality game in the park, you'll be in your living room or in your office. And obviously, if you want to have 5G, you need to make sure the indoor coverage is and capacity is good enough to support that. And I think that those are still missing, and especially for markets that have lots of mid-band, 3.5, 4.x gigahertz, and especially millimeter wave. And we've seen more developments in the vendor side around that, and the operators are starting to deploy stuff. But if I was a game developer, I wouldn't be expecting to have indoor, ultra reliable, low latency, or frankly, an industrial manufacturer either, automation system provider, unless it's a dedicated implementation.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think despite the fact that 5G coverage and quality is clearly improving, I think it's still very early days. And frankly, even with Vodafone just trialing their standalone core, I know KT in South Korea launched theirs with Samsung the other day, and lots of countries are auctioning millimeter wave, things like that. I think Australia started deploying theirs not long ago. But the reality is, until you have this really ubiquitous high quality coverage, you can't just have non-standalone 5G in some areas and pure standalone 5G in the urban centers.
Yeah,
because a lot of the value comes in the travel, the fact that you can take these applications and use them on the move or on the go. And until you have that, it simply isn't going to be delivering the really kind of exciting new use cases that everybody's been so excited about.
I mean, that doesn't mean that, there are some applications which can use, if you like, localized 5G coverage, or where you can have dedicated indoor systems, but they're relatively few and far between. The most obvious one is fixed wireless. Fixed wireless access you can offer where you've got 5G, and you don't offer it in places where you don't. Yeah, and if your mapping and your operations software is good enough, you can basically have someone put their, not just their postcode, but even their apartment number in and say, sorry, you're on the wrong side of the building. Whereas the people on the side of the apartment block which faces the tower can get fixed wireless. So I think that there certainly are things like that. Or I can imagine there might be an urban core or outdoor, certain smart city applications where someone's done all of the radio planning and they monitor it effectively. But it puts, you certainly can't say, right, there's nationwide, 5-millisecond cloud gaming to everyone everywhere, including sitting on your sofa. That's just not happening for now.
I think something else we're noticing is infrastructure costs are going down as the major vendors really kind of do battle over making RAN equipment lighter. I know I think Nokia was the one that most recently released part of their portfolio to bring out a new MIMO antenna that's far lighter than competitors and presumably won't require a crane to deploy. Dean, I don't know whether you want to comment on what kind of impact that's going to have.
I mean, certainly, both Nokia recently, but previously Huawei and Ericsson and others as well have really been sort of focusing on reducing the weight, because some of the original panels used for the antennas were not quite the size of a fridge, but they were too heavy for one person to install. Which obviously then if you start, I remember talking to the head of Vodafone UK's networks on a webinar recently, and I asked what was the most surprising thing you wish you'd known 2 years ago about 5G deployment, and it was how much scaffolding costs was the precise answer. And it's that thing of how do you get a large box up how much extra does it cost you to have to strengthen the mounting points, to pay extra for the roof space or whatever? Do you need to hire a crane? So there's now this has been this real push towards getting to high performance units below about 20 kilos, which I think is probably where it starts to be installable by a single person more easily. So certainly Nokia made announcements recently, and the other two big vendors as well. There's some debate about sort of, is it exact apples for apples? Is it 32 or 64-way MIMO? But yeah, they're sort of decent high-end products are definitely shrinking in size. And ironically, actually, for millimeter wave, they should be physically smaller still because of the wave.
I think, before we move on to just the sort of demand side and the services side, the other thing that's happened in the last, few months is that we have some big announcements from Dish partnering with AWS and AT&T selling its sort of, network development business to Microsoft. So I think those are, if we think about it with the lens of the infrastructure costs and skills, those partnerships or, those deals are really about how do we make the sort of software development work around 5G scalable and manageable as a telco, because, it's becoming more of a global business, even if the implementation is local, telco by telco, and, can telcos compete at that level? And, that's kind of the underlying question that we don't necessarily have explicitly sort of the hyperscalers and telcos relationship, but that kind of feeds into the infrastructure costs and skills question. It feeds into the new players coming into telecoms that are reflected on the 5G-aliser. Moving on to the demand side, I mean, I think that everyone knows, there's lots of questions around, what are the 5G services? And I probably won't surprise anyone to see that we're all a room of skeptics about the availability of 5G services. I don't know, Harry, Nicola, if you want to chat about some of the stuff that you've seen.
Yeah, I think we've mentioned it to a certain degree already, that I think for most consumers in most countries, and obviously this excludes the really advanced countries like parts of China and South Korea, I think having the 5G connection just simply isn't going to be that different of an experience as we've kind of already said. But that doesn't mean that they're not the specific applications aren't being developed. I think things like AR gaming and things like that is being kind of showcased at the moment a lot. And while we're still very far away from that being widely adopted, I think there is gradually becoming more of a buzz about these things, which is certainly a positive side. But for the enterprises, it's a similar story where, as you mentioned at the start of the call, we've already previously noticed that private deployments of 5G are obviously becoming increasingly popular for various industries, and things like smart factories, smart agriculture. I think ports are very popular. Lots of the telcos are really exploring these possibilities, and I think in general that enterprise side of things is going to be far more exciting certainly in the short term than in the long term. I'm not sure, Nicola, if you've seen similar stuff from your own research.
Yes, I would agree with that. There seem to be certainly some developments in relation to cloud services, usually linked to edge computing applications. That's where telcos are kind of wrapping their 5G in with offerings often delivered in partnership with hyperscalers and private 5G, as you say. But other than that, the focus seems to have been quite a lot on kind of more 5G ready types of services as opposed to 5G specific propositions. I think there are interesting developments in the pipeline, but for now, what's actually out there is quite limited in terms of capitalizing on 5G, and that's largely, as you say, a result of kind of the lack of standalone cores and standalone infrastructure going across the network.
I think one of the things that's kind of interesting is the fact that it's obviously requiring all these telcos to make partnerships with enterprises they've not really worked with in the past and have no history with. And so it's kind of having to redefine how you deal with these businesses. And that, whilst there's a lot of opportunities there's also a lot of places to make mistakes. And I think there's a big disparity between some operators who are playing it quite safe and kind of deploying it in a small scale, and others who are really making large deployments with things like ports and trying to do stuff on a very large scale immediately. And it'd be really interesting to see which of those is more successful in the long term.
I'd maybe make a distinction between 5G specific services and 5G specific applications. There are few 5G specific applications. Almost all applications work well on a good 4G network and well on a good Wi-Fi network, especially with 6 and 6E. There may be some in future, but they're going to be the ones which use certainly standalone core, but also release 16, 17, 18 features, which have some things which are 5G specific in them, like time sensitive networking, but that's not going to be around for years. 5G specific services is different because a service can essentially be a new bundle or pricing plan. And so I think that the economics of 5G may make it more attractive to offer flat rate, to offer perhaps where there's been bundled video, you go from standard definition to HD or UHD. There may well be particular content partnerships or gaming partnerships which are just available to the max or the top tier, which also has 5G in it. And so there's a bunch of stuff which, if you like, correlates with 5G rather than being caused by it.
And I guess that's kind of similar to the distinction you were making, Nicola, between like 5G specific services versus 5G ready services.
Yeah.
Great. Any more for any more? Super. Good. I mean, I think that we've shared some stuff today. So our first attempt at, giving a video version of our 5G-aliser. So, thanks team for doing it. I hope you guys found it helpful, and, stay tuned for next quarter's update.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that we're interested in feedback on the format as well. I mean, given time zones, it's difficult to do one of these that's live. I mean, I did a personal experiment with a Twitter Space, the audio drop-in chat last week, which is a bit like Clubhouse. That's quite fun, but it's a bit less curated because it's open to the world. It is more like a casual audio chat. But I'm really interested in feedback on this or anyone's idea on platforms as well.
Super. Thanks, everybody.